Welcome to Visions and Reflections, an Isap conversation series where we meet therapists, psychoanalysts, counselors who work in many different fields of study, work, and interest. Our aim is to expand awareness of how psychodynamics is present in our lives and how it influences our thinking, choices, and activities. Today we welcome DaSilva from Johannesburg.
Say good morning and thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
From Johannesburg to Montpellier, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm an independent counselor in Johannesburg. Part of what I do is I also work with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, which is a non-government organization that has helplines where people from South Africa, from around the country, phone in to get mental health help from volunteers. And in that particular setting, I think a lot of what happens in that setting is more to do with trying to link up people that have phoned in that are particularly in distress, to try and contain them for a little bit and then to refer them to mental health professionals so that they can get help in that way. In terms of actually counseling or, creating a space for therapy, it's not really in that setting that is done, because, you get phone calls from people that are really in a quite a profound state of distress. People would phone in that are in various stages of depression, and this is more medicalized idea of what depression and anxiety is. So how would they fit the DSM criteria of depression or anxiety? So it's very medicalized. And then what happens is you try and link them up to either medical doctors, mental health professionals, or psychiatrists, and also help them to navigate the government mental health system, which has quite some tricky ways of getting into. So that is actually quite a I want to say it's a formulaic way of working. So there's a very particular way of working. The thing that I find most interesting is, how do you take somebody that phones in to what is essentially a perfect stranger and is in a state of panic, or is in a state of depression, or is contemplating suicide, and how do you manage to find a point at which they become stable enough for their cognitive functioning to come back online, so that you can have a conversation with them as to what to do next. So that's been very interesting, because you've got to work very quickly, and you've got to make a connection very quickly, and then you don't have the luxury of being visual, so you can't really see their body language, you can't see how they're reacting to what you say. You just basically got to go on what you hear. And I found that over the years, it's helped me develop an ear to really tune into what people are saying, and how they're saying it. So I found that actually quite helpful. When you're in a state of, that's the one thing. The other thing as well that I found by working there is it helps me regulate my own affect when I get somebody on the phone that's in a state of panic. How do I then keep myself on an even keel so that I can use my faculties to actually be of help and not fall into the story, if that's making
exactly
sense. Yeah.
Which is interesting, because in therapy, analytical therapy, and psychoanalysis, part of the formation is to, or part of our formation is to go through our own analysis. We call that didactic. Yeah. And that keeps us neutral in a way, as a therapist, as a psychoanalyst eventually, so that when I have a patient in front of me, I don't, and if I've actually had the same sort of blocks or problems or symptoms in my life, I'm neutral. I don't lean towards it with a special sympathy. So I'm there, empathetic, but I've gone through my didactic, my own analysis. So there, I'm sort of a neutral person right in front of them, but with empathy.
The other thing that I found was interesting as well is that I ran a psychoanalytic group because there's an organization in Johannesburg called Ububele, and they run programs to train conductors in psychoanalytic groups.
Okay.
And I did a 2-year course with them. And as part of that experience, I had to run my own group. So what I did was I had 8 counselors, 8 SADAG counselors. And what we did is we got together once a week over a period of 10 weeks. And then we tried to track whether they were having residual effects from the shift that they have done. So in other words, people would ordinarily, a counselor would come in on a 4-hour shift once a week. So say, for example, they'll come in and they'll do an 8 to 12 shift on a Wednesday. Then what we did is experientially inside the group, we tried to track whether they had the residual effect of being in that session later on in the week. And we started finding that 2-3 days later, after doing your shift, if you've had a particularly harrowing experience, you'd get images or almost like auditory flashbacks of a conversation you may have had on the phone.
Okay.
But if you weren't aware that this was linked to that, you'd somehow act out. You'd suddenly have a very short temper, or you'd find yourself doing something that was out of character, out of your own character. So you might become very withdrawn, you might feel depressed, you might get very aggravated. That seemed unrelated to the things that were happening around you. And we tracked several occasions where that happened. But more importantly, what started to happen is if that wasn't resolved in between your 2 shifts, then you'd come back a week later and you might actually act out in the call center.
So these were the therapists that were working on different phone shifts.
Yes.
And they were absorbing the experiences and the emotions into themselves. They were carrying that. So how did they get rid of those emotions they were carrying inside that were being actually not spoken, but just kind of perceived? How did they get through that? Did they have their own therapy?
Well, some of them did, but the most important part of it is that because we made it explicit, in the groups, we came to realize that the overarching feeling that we were all trying to get away from, to try and almost deny existence, was that when you're on a phone call with somebody who's in particular distress and you get sucked into the story or activates a part of you that reminds you of something that happened to you.
Exactly.
It puts you in this almost uncontained feeling of helplessness. You just feel so helpless in the phone call because you don't know whether the person is going to take any of what you say seriously. You don't have visual feedback. The person may never phone back again. They may tell you a harrowing story, feel better, and leave you with the effects of that harrowing story. And you then get this enormous feeling of, I just don't know if this made a difference. And so it's that feeling of helplessness that we then, that seemed to underpin the effects of what was left behind from being in that therapy session. or in that, let's call it the shift of time that you spend. Once we'd made it explicit in the group and we started talking to colleagues around it, what we realized is that if you get shifted in your therapy, in your session, in your shift, you
Right.
get moved in your shift by a harrowing phone call. The easiest way to get through it is to grab a colleague and just talk through your experience. So, so there's an example that this girl that I was on shift with,
Right.
she got a phone call from somebody who was talking about family incest. So in other words, somebody had phoned in, and I think it was the father. It wasn't my phone call, so I don't remember the details, but I think it was the father that had phoned in, who admitted to the counselor that he was sexually abusing a family member. Okay, I think it was the daughter. And I looked at this girl, and she was 23, 24 years old.
Yeah.
And I visibly saw like the blood drain out of her face. It was a weird thing. It was in my peripheral vision, but I saw like her face changed. And then when she'd finished the phone call and she put the phone down, I said to her, that looks like it was a really tough call. What happened?
Right.
And she told me the story immediately. This guy phoned in, he did this, blah, blah. And then it didn't seem like she had any relief by telling me. So then I said to her, well, what did it do to your body? How did it feel? Where did you feel like that it like it hit? And she immediately said, it felt like I'd been punched in the stomach.
Okay.
And then when she said that, it's almost like her shoulders dropped and the color came back to her face.
Okay.
So it was in relating what it had done to her physically.
Right.
That it allowed her to let that feeling go. Then she almost came back online. It's almost as if the system.
So the fact that she was able to identify and communicate, and as a result, that equals symbolizing. She was able to symbolize that, and so that actually sort of discharged the shock and the trauma of hearing this story.
Yeah.
I know that you are a first-year student at EIPA or a second-year student?
No, first year. Yeah.
Okay. So very interesting that you're doing this from long distance. That's quite amazing, because I was in the classroom, so it always makes me happy that, you know, internationally people all over the world are connecting with the same studies. Yeah. And something that I did do I did formation in hypnotherapy, but also in movement oculaire, MOT we call it, movement oculaire thérapeutique, or in English sometimes it's called EMDR. It's a little different, eye movement deprogrammation. And there, I'm thinking of that because of the shock, the trauma, and taking in these emotions, which you were saying is frequent with hearing these harrowing stories, you know, unbelievable, and to absorb it and to guide these people. And so what we use sometimes is this eye movement therapy, which you go to the trauma or even the shock of, it could be something you heard on your shift, on your 4-hour shift. Yeah, well, maybe come to the next formation in Montpellier. Be a good excuse to come to France. But because Delphine has done it in a different sort of way, where you bring back the trauma from the unconscious to the conscious, if it was, you know, actually blocked, and you relive it, and then you heal it. And you don't only heal it, you actually join the child to the adult, if it was a childhood trauma, and you're reliving the symptoms as an adult. And it's, you create that very, very safe spot. I could say like a safe, magical place where that person goes and that that's really the healing part of it. And you were able to go forward then,
That makes
past
sense.
this trauma, past the shock, the block. Do they have eye movement therapy in Joburg? Is that
I've
that-
heard rumblings of it, but I don't know of anybody, like personally, I don't know of anybody that has,
Oh, really?
yeah, mm, I
Hmm.
haven't actually. It hasn't been something that, you know, the funny thing is that it seems to me that the type of therapy that is taught
Mhm.
shifts from university to university. So the university that my wife trained at, which is the Wits University, they seem to have a more kind of psychodynamic, um, yeah, a more kind of psychodynamic training.
Okay.
Whereas the University of Pretoria seems to have more a lean towards, and I'm speaking under correction, but I think they have a lean more towards like a CBT type of orientation, you know, so that's more in the here and now. And
Okay.
then I studied at UNISA, which is the University of South Africa, and they have more um,
Right.
systemic view. Now, the thing is, politically, South Africa is set up in that we have a lot of residual trauma just that floats around from the years and years of apartheid and
Right.
the split in the social fabric that was engineered. Really, it was engineered by
Yeah.
politicians to keep people separate.
Right.
And in that, a lot of trauma was caused, and on top of it, it broke down the family unit. And it's interesting that even in the course, how much emphasis is put. Well, that in my mind, emphasis is put in the attachment theory and how all of that hangs together, the psyche and how important it is. And in
Mhm.
fact, in South Africa, with migrant labor, so you had entire communities kept away from each other because the government would only allow, for example, men to go and work on a mine to
Mhm.
earn a living, and then they would send that money back home, and it could be hundreds of kilometers from home. So they'd have
Right.
to reside far away from home, and therefore
Yes.
it left the woman to raise children literally on their own
Right.
without the third, without that. So you've got
So the father was absent, or the paternal figure was absent.
completely absent.
Okay.
And that created its own set of traumas. It created its own set of, so you've got entire generations that grew up with a
Mhm.
big gaping hole where the father should have been, and
Exactly.
all sorts of other things are put in there.
Mhm.
You know, so
Yeah.
we've got that as a basis for the society that is endemic in the way that South Africa, and on top of it, there's still an enormous distance between people that are economically sound and people that are just barely able to feed their children, and
Right.
those people are obviously the most traumatized. So the family system, the structural attachment that is supposed to
Mhm.
underpin the development of children hasn't been sound for many years. So I think
Right.
psychology plays this weird, very weird dance in that there's a move and there's an intellectual move towards community psychology, doing groups, having advocacy,
Right.
talking about it a lot in the media, and yet it seems like the goal for psychologists in South Africa is to qualify and go into private practice, where you're seeing one-on-one, and usually the middle class, people that can afford it, that have health insurance, which actually takes them out of the training and more into kind of, well, I can earn a good living by doing this. And
Right.
it's this weird dance that happens. So you have this enormous disparity between people that offer therapy at a premium to individuals, and we have this entire community and society that so desperately need that really are kept out of the psychological help just because they can't afford it. In my private work, I tend to be a little outside of the box. And
Yeah.
I want to do that. I do it consciously. People that, and sometimes what happens is that people at SADAG that find they have people, especially other counselors, that are in themselves struggling to be counselors because of the stuff that is being brought up while they're in a counseling session. They often send them to me for what is known as debriefing. So somebody would be on a shift, get rattled by a phone call and want to go home or not want to come back for their next shift. And they say, look, before you make any decisions, speak to Joe. Let's see if we can get to that. And those people come to me. And then what we do is we try and track what it is that happened in that conversation that pulled them to this space that it triggered all these images, these symptoms. A very similar thing that happened to me with that little girl in the bathroom in Cape Town. And then when we're able to find that and unlock that, then it starts unlocking a series of events. And often what they do is they say, look, I want to speak to somebody about it, but I'm a student. I can't afford therapy. And I'll just say to them, well, I don't think that money should be a reason for this not to happen. So I'll see you next week. And then just take it from where and then the next week they pitch up, and then we try and take it one step at a time, and like from session to session, how are you doing? And I've actually got several people that I've got actually one girl that has been with me for a year now. A year, yeah. And every week she's either on Zoom with me or she's in my room, and we go through this, and she's doing amazing. She's doing really, really well.
Now, psychodynamics is something that you're also incorporating into your personal life, or at least thinking about it a little bit as a father, being the father figure in your family. And I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about that, just about the way psychodynamics has kind of affected your personal life and experiences.
Well, I think part of this has organized itself in my own thinking organically, because I'm married to a clinical psychologist, and she was trained in psychodynamics. So when she was going through training, especially when it came around Freud and Klein and Winnicott, we would have these discussions about what she was experiencing by reading this, and relative to her own upbringing and relative to mine. We would talk in those terms already, but for me it was really an orientation. It was kind of orientated that way, and it seemed to me to be a natural fit. So much so that when I juxtaposed that to B.F. Skinner or the cognitive behavioral guys, I felt a disconnect from that theory, and just a natural kind of disconnect from it. When I went and I did my undergrad at university, and that was only about 4 or 5 years ago, wasn't that long ago. Then the same thing happened. I would go into the psychodynamic type of understanding of it, and I would
Mhm.
dive into that and really get very enamored by it and feel an organic pull towards it. And then the more sterile kind of statistical stuff and all that, I tend to have to really work hard just to stay on task, let alone to understand it, right?
Right.
So that was, I had a cursory understanding of it, and then I did the Ububele course, which was very helpful. It was almost like a self-therapy as well inside of a group, which was tremendously helpful. And then when I started the course at the beginning, well, towards the end of last year with Delphine, there was a lot of these things actually came into like stark reality. So it wasn't an arm's length kind of thing. It became experiential. So I started finding myself shifting in my own kind of system of thinking when I thought about attachment theory relative to my children, for example.
Right.
My own experience as a child relative to my siblings, my own experience relative to my mother. And
Yeah.
The one thing that I've always, and I was in therapy for a long time over this as well, is that I lost my father when I was very young. So at 9, 10 years old, my father died accidentally in a car accident. So that disrupted our family a tremendous amount. And we struggled for many, many years. I have an older brother and a younger brother, and we were a year apart. So being from a good Catholic family, it was just children on children on children. I don't know how they did it, but they somehow managed. And we were 3 of us, and all 3 of us feel the effect of not having a father figure, you know?
That father figure, exactly.
Yeah. So we tracking that information with it as it comes up in the theory was I felt some significant shifts in my own thinking around it, you know, having it actually just jump out of the page and going, oh, I know what that is, you know.
Yeah, and it's actually very therapeutic for yourself, very cathartic
Yeah, very much so, very much
to
so.
connect on that recognition of what they're talking about, the theory, and say, okay, and you personalize it and say, right, I went through that. And then sometimes it's not so easy to get there. You know, all of us are in our own personal analysis. And we're punching to get there at the end because personal stories just have to be unraveled and gone through and symbolized and digested. And that is part of, I'd say, half of the work to becoming an analytical therapist or a psychoanalyst is really that personal journey, that experience, that recognition, and getting through it.
A lot of these things actually came into like stark reality. So it wasn't an arm's length kind of thing. It became experiential. So I started finding myself shifting in my own kind of system of thinking when I thought about attachment theory relative to my children, for example.
Right.
My own experience as a child relative to my siblings, my own experience relative to my mother. And the one thing that I've always, and I was in therapy for a long time over this as well, is that I lost my father when I was very young. So at 9, 10 years old, my father died accidentally in a car accident. So that disrupted our family a tremendous amount. And we struggled for many, many years. I have an older brother and a younger brother, and we were a year apart. So being from a good Catholic family, it was just children on children on children. I don't know how they did it, but they somehow managed. And we were 3 of us, and all 3 of us feel the effect of not having a father figure, you know?
That father figure, exactly.
Yeah. So we tracking that information with it as it comes up in the theory was I felt some significant shifts in my own thinking around it. You know, having it actually just jump out of the page and going, oh, I know what that is. You know.
Yeah, and it's actually very therapeutic for yourself, very cathartic
Yeah, very much so. Very much
to
so.
connect on that recognition of what they're talking about, the theory, and say, okay, and you personalize it and say, right, I went through that. And then sometimes it's not so easy to get there. You know, all of us are in our own personal analysis. And we're punching to get there at the end because personal stories just have to be unraveled and gone through and symbolized and digested. And that is part of, I'd say, half of the work to becoming an analytical therapist or a psychoanalyst is really that personal journey, that experience, that recognition, and getting through it. Okay, well, Joe, I guess that's about all we have time for today. We've spoken a good 40 minutes there.
Awesome.
I think so, right?